Mom said lonely people need friends, said the little boy to the vampire king on the silent midnight flight. And in that moment, an ancient ruler felt something he thought had died centuries ago: hope. The airport terminal was a cathedral of chaos and fluorescent light, echoing with gate change announcements and the shuffle of exhausted travelers. Outside, winter fog pressed against the massive windows like something alive, swallowing the runway in thick, ghostly white. Inside, passengers clutched boarding passes with numb fingers and prayed their red eye wouldn't be the next cancellation flashing across the departure screens. Serena Hale shifted her worn travel bag higher on her shoulder and tightened her grip on her son's small hand. Her honey-blonde hair, once carefully tied back, had given up hours ago, strands falling loose across her pale, tired face. Her coat was too thin for the cold seeping through the terminal doors. Her boots were scuffed at the toes. But her eyes, though exhausted, held something unbreakable. "Almost there, baby," she whispered, crouching to meet Milo's gaze at gate 14. Milo nodded, clutching his stuffed penguin to his chest. "Is it warm where we're going?" Serena smiled despite everything. The warmest. They were supposed to be seated in row 29, tucked into the back of the plane with the other budget travelers. But as they approached the gate agent, a young woman with a tablet glanced up with a strange expression, half confusion, half nervousness. "Miss Hale?" she asked carefully. "Yes. There's been a seating adjustment. We've moved you and your son to row 3. Business class." Serena blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Overbooking in economy," the agent said quickly, though something in her tone didn't quite match the explanation. "Merry Christmas." "Hey, my beautiful family. Thank you so much for staying with me through everything. Your support truly means the world to me. We're back, and I've got so many amazing stories lined up for you." Quick request before we start. If you're excited for today's story, please hit the subscribe button. It helps us grow this family even bigger. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love connecting with you all. Trust me, tomorrow's story is just as gripping as today's. You won't want to miss it. Now, let's begin. Serena stared at the new boarding passes, then at Milo, who grinned up at her like they'd just won the lottery. She followed the jetway in a daze, clutching his hand a little tighter, wondering what kind of luck, good or cursed, had just found them. The business cabin felt like stepping through a veil into another realm. The lighting was softer, amber and shadowed. The seats were wide, wrapped in leather that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and something older, something unnameable. Only a handful of passengers occupied the space, scattered like islands in an empty sea. And in seat 3A, near the window, sat a man who did not belong to this world at all. Valen Draker sat impossibly still, his long silver hair falling like frost over the high collar of his embroidered black coat. A glass of red wine rested in his pale hand, though he did not drink. His gaze was fixed on the fog beyond the window, and his eyes, those unnerving crimson eyes, saw nothing of the present. He saw centuries. He saw betrayal. He saw the face of a child he had buried 1,000 years ago. He did not look up when Serena and Milo took the seats across the narrow aisle. Serena settled Milo into his seat, fumbling with the buckle, acutely aware of the cold presence mere feet away. She didn't need to look directly at him to feel it, the weight of something ancient, something wrong. The other passengers avoided even glancing in his direction. The flight attendants moved past him, with their eyes lowered. But Milo stared. His little brow furrowed as he studied the man's profile. After a long moment, he tugged on Serena's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, though it wasn't quite quiet enough. "Why is he so sad?" Serena's breath caught. She glanced at the stranger, at Valen, and felt ice crawl down her spine. "Maybe he's just tired, sweetheart. Let's leave him alone." Milo nodded slowly, but his gaze didn't waver. Then, before Serena could stop him, he unbuckled his seatbelt, clutched his penguin plushie, and slipped into the aisle. "Milo," Serena reached for him, but he was already moving. He stopped in front of Valen, tiny and fearless, and reached out to gently touch the sleeve of that impossibly dark coat. Valen's head turned with the slow, predatory grace of something that did not need to rush. His crimson eyes locked onto the child. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. "Hi," Milo said, his voice clear and small. "You look really lonely." Serena's heart stopped. "Mom said lonely people need friends," Milo continued, tilting his head. "I can be your friend." For a moment, nothing happened. Valen simply stared at the boy, at those wide, guileless eyes that saw not a monster, not a king, but only someone in pain. No one had looked at him like that in 1,000 years. Not with recognition. Not with innocence. Something cracked inside him. Serena scrambled to pull Milo back, her face flushing hot with fear and embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, he doesn't understand." But Valen raised one pale hand, not in threat, but in something gentler. His voice, when it came, was low and fractured, like stone breaking under pressure. "It's all right." He looked at Milo again, and the faintest ghost of something, surprise, sorrow, warmth, flickered across his ancient face. "Perhaps," he said quietly, I do need a friend tonight." Milo beamed. Serena stared at the man, really looked at him, and for the first time since boarding, she realized she was sitting across from someone who, despite having lived longer than empires, might be the loneliest soul she had ever met. And for the first time in centuries, Valen Draker felt something stir beneath the ice of his chest. Something fragile. Something human. The plane's engines rumbled to life. The cabin lights dimmed. Outside, the fog swallowed the world whole as the aircraft lifted into the cold, silent night. Inside, a child held a stuffed penguin, a mother held her breath, and a vampire king held onto the last thread of warmth he thought he'd lost forever. The flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, their eyes averted from row 3. One of them, Rena, young and sharp-eyed, paused near the galley and glanced back at the seats where the Hales and the VIP sat. She pulled out her tablet, scrolling through the seating manifest with a frown. The seat change hadn't been random. She was sure of it now, but she said nothing. Some things, she decided, were better left unquestioned. Milo leaned toward Valen again, holding out his penguin. "Do you want to hold him? His name is Waddles. He makes people feel better." Valen looked at the toy, then at the boy, and slowly, impossibly, he accepted it. His cold fingers closed around the worn fabric. Serena watched, her pulse still racing, and realized she had no idea what she'd just set in motion. But as the plane climbed higher, as the darkness pressed against the windows and the world below disappeared, one truth settled in her chest like a stone. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. Valen's gaze returned to the window, but he no longer saw the fog. He saw the throne room where his son had taken his last breath. He saw the faces of those who had betrayed him, the kingdom he had abandoned rather than rule, with an empty heart. And now, holding a stuffed penguin in a darkened cabin 30,000 feet above the earth, he wondered if fate had finally decided to offer him one last chance at something he thought was a myth: redemption. Serena pulled Milo back into his seat, but her eyes kept drifting to the pale stranger across the aisle. She thought of the man she was running from, the threats whispered in parking lots, the fear that had driven her to scrape together every dollar for this flight. She had been fleeing toward safety. She hadn't expected to find it sitting next to a monster. And Milo, oblivious to the weight of the moment, smiled to himself and whispered, "He's not lonely anymore." The fog outside pressed against the window like a living thing, thick and swirling in the aircraft's lights. Valen watched it twist and curl, but his mind was elsewhere. Centuries elsewhere. He saw snow falling on marble steps slick with blood. He saw the throne room of Eldrathis, vast and silent, lit only by the dying embers of what had once been his court. He saw his son, small, mortal, beloved, lying still in his arms while his advisors stood in the shadows, their faces masks of false grief. They had orchestrated it all. The poisoning. The coup. The choice they'd forced upon him: become the tyrant they needed, or lose everything. He had chosen exile. 1,000 years of wandering. 1,000 years of cold. He had built empires in the dark, commanded armies that moved like shadows across continents, and crushed those foolish enough to challenge him. But none of it had filled the void left by that one small life extinguished too soon. Valen's fingers tightened around the stuffed penguin still resting in his lap. The absurdity of it should have been laughable, a vampire king clutching a child's toy at 30,000 feet. Yet something about its worn fabric, the faint scent of laundry detergent and innocence, anchored him to the present in a way nothing had in centuries. He glanced across the aisle. The boy, Milo, had finally settled into a seat, though his curious eyes still flickered toward Valen every few moments. The mother was digging through her bag, pulling out a small container of crackers and a juice box, her movements practiced and efficient despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Serena kept her hands busy because stillness invited memory, and memory invited fear. She opened the crackers for Milo, smiling as he took them, but her mind was 3 states away. She saw Derek's face, the way his expression had shifted from charm to cold rage in the space of a heartbeat. She heard his voice. "You think you can just leave? You think I'll let you take him?" Whispered too close in a grocery store parking lot, in the hallway outside her apartment, in the messages that appeared on her phone no matter how many times she blocked his number. She had saved for 18 months to afford these tickets. 18 months of double shifts, skipped meals, and sleeping on her friend's couch. She told no one where they were going, not even her mother, not until they were safely on the ground. But even now, 30,000 feet above the earth, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he'd find them. Milo finished his crackers and pulled a small sticker sheet from his coat pocket, glittery stars and cartoon animals, the kind handed out at doctors' offices. He studied them seriously, then looked up at Valen. "Mister," he said softly. Valen turned his head. Milo held out a gold star sticker. "This one's for being brave. You looked sad, but you didn't yell at me. That's brave." Serena reached for him. "Milo, sweetheart, we shouldn't." But Valen extended his hand, palm up. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as if he were performing some ancient ritual. Milo carefully pressed the sticker onto Valen's pale palm, then sat back with a satisfied nod. For a moment, Valen simply stared at the tiny gold star against his skin. Then, impossibly, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. Something forgotten. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. From the galley, Rena watched with wide eyes. She nudged Owen, the senior flight attendant, and nodded toward row 3. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Owen frowned. "See what?" He accepted something from the kid. "The VIP. He's been sitting there like a statue for an hour, and now he's—" She stopped, shaking her head. "Something's not right about this." Owen gave her a warning look. "We were told not to ask questions." The handler was very clear. But Rena couldn't let it go. She pulled out her tablet and scrolled through the manifest again, cross-referencing the original seat assignments with a final boarding list. Her frown deepened. The Hales had been booked in 29C and 29D for weeks. The change had been logged at 11:47 p.m., less than 15 minutes before boarding. No agent signature. No override code. Just a sudden, unexplained reassignment that placed them directly across from the VIP who had paid an obscene amount for privacy. "This wasn't an overbooking," Rena murmured. "This was deliberate." "What are you talking about?" Owen asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked back at Valen, at the way his gaze lingered on the child, at the subtle tension in his posture, not predatory, but protective, watchful. He wanted them near him, she realized. But why? The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and the cabin shuddered. Milo clutched his mother's arm, and Serena instinctively pulled him closer. Valen's hand moved to the armrest, steadying himself with inhuman stillness, his eyes never leaving the boy. When the turbulence passed, Valen spoke without turning his head. His voice carried across the narrow aisle, low and careful. "Your child is unusual." Serena's breath caught. She looked at him, really looked at him and saw something in those crimson eyes that wasn't hunger or malice. It was recognition and sorrow. He just sees hearts, she said quietly, even when people hide them. Valen was silent for a long moment. Then, almost too softly to hear, he replied, "Perhaps that is why he terrifies me." Serena didn't know what to say to that. She didn't know what to say to any of this, to the impossible man across the aisle, to the way Milo had attached himself to a stranger who looked like he'd stepped out of a Gothic painting, to the strange sense that this flight, this moment, was not an accident. Milo yawned and leaned against her shoulder, his small fingers still clutching the edge of Waddles the penguin. Within moments, his breathing slowed into the steady rhythm of sleep. Valen watched the boy's chest rise and fall, and something ancient and broken inside him ached with a pain he'd thought long buried. "Sleep well, little one," he whispered in a language no living human knew. "You have reminded a monster what it is to feel." And outside the window, the fog swallowed the stars, and the night stretched on. The plane shuddered. It wasn't the gentle rocking of normal turbulence. It was violent, sudden, as if an invisible fist had slammed into the aircraft's belly. The cabin lights flickered. Overhead compartments rattled. A carry-on bag tumbled into the aisle with a heavy thud. Serena jerked awake from the half-sleep she'd fallen into, her arms instinctively tightening around Milo. But he was already stirring, blinking groggily, trying to sit up. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though her own pulse hammered. "Just some bumps." The plane dropped. For 3 seconds, gravity disappeared. Serena's stomach lurched into her throat. Milo gasped, his small body lifting slightly from the seat despite the belt. Then the aircraft caught itself, slamming back into stable air with a force that made the walls groan. "Remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," came the captain's voice, tight and clipped. "We're experiencing unexpected weather conditions." Milo unbuckled his belt before Serena could stop him. Sliding down from his seat, Waddles clutched to his chest. "I need to go to the bathroom." "Milo, no, sit." But the plane lurched again, harder this time, and Milo stumbled forward into the aisle. His small body tilted, arms pinwheeling, heading straight for the sharp edge of the seat in front of him. Serena screamed. But before her cry fully left her throat, before she could even lunge forward, Valen moved. He was simply there, faster than thought, faster than breath. His hand caught Milo mid-fall, steadying the boy with impossible gentleness even as the plane bucked and swayed around them. Valen's other hand braced against the seat, holding himself and the child perfectly still while the rest of the cabin shook. It happened in less than a second, but Serena saw it all. She saw the inhuman speed, the preternatural grace, the way Valen had moved from seated to standing without any visible transition, as if reality had simply bent around him. And she saw his eyes, those crimson eyes that now seemed to glow faintly in the dimmed cabin light. Valen carefully lifted Milo back to his feet, releasing him only when the turbulence settled. "Stay seated," he said quietly. "It's safer." Milo nodded, wide-eyed but unafraid. "Thank you, mister." Serena couldn't breathe. Her hands were shaking. She pulled Milo back to his seat, buckled him in with trembling fingers, and then slowly, very slowly, turned to face Valen. "What are you?" she whispered. The other passengers were too distracted by the turbulence to notice. The cabin crew was strapped into their jump seats. But Serena had seen, and she needed to know. Valen settled back into his seat with that same unnatural stillness. He didn't avoid her gaze. "You should rest," he said. "The storm will pass." "Don't." Serena's voice hardened despite her fear. "Don't lie to me. No human moves like that. No human has eyes like yours." She leaned closer, keeping her voice low but fierce. "What are you?" For a long moment, Valen said nothing. Then he turned to face her fully, and for the first time, she saw something raw in his expression. Not the menace. Exhaustion. "I am older than your empires," he said simply. "Older than your nation's first stone. I have walked this earth for 1,000 years, and I am very, very tired. Serena's breath caught. She couldn't say it. The word felt too absurd, too impossible. A monster, Valen finished. Yes. Are we in danger? Her hand moved instinctively to Milo's shoulder. Not from me. His voice softened. Never from me. Then why are you here? On this plane? Valen looked away, his jaw tight. I am running. The same as you. Serena blinked. You don't know anything about me. I know you're fleeing something, Valen said quietly. I know you've spent every moment since boarding checking over your shoulder. I know you're terrified someone will find you. He met her eyes again. I recognize the survivors, Serena Hale. I am one. The use of her full name should have frightened her. Instead, it grounded her. She forced herself to breathe, to think. What are you running from? Valen's expression darkened. Betrayal. Grief. A kingdom I no longer wish to rule. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked at the edges. I had a son once. Long ago. He was mortal. Fragile. I thought I could protect him from everything. His hands curled into fists on the armrests. I was wrong. And when they took him from me, when those I trusted most used his death to force my hand, I chose exile over vengeance. I chose silence over becoming the tyrant they wanted. He looked at Milo, sleeping peacefully now despite the turbulence. I have not spoken of him in centuries. Yet your son. He stopped, unable to finish. Serena felt tears prick her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be. Valen's voice steadied. Your child reminded me that grief is not all I am. Overhead, a compartment began to rattle violently, the latch weakening with each shake of the plane. Owen, the senior flight attendant, unstrapped himself despite the continued turbulence, reaching up to secure it. But before he could, the latch gave way. The compartment door swung open, and a heavy suitcase tipped forward, plummeting toward a sleeping passenger 3 rows back. Valen's hand rose, barely a gesture, a subtle flex of his fingers. The suitcase stopped midair. Owen froze, his eyes widening as he watched the luggage hover for a heartbeat before settling gently back into the compartment. The door clicked shut on its own, the latch re-engaging with a soft snick. Owen's gaze snapped to Valen, who sat perfectly still, his expression neutral. Their eyes met. Valen inclined his head slightly, not a threat, but an acknowledgement. Owen swallowed hard, then quickly strapped himself back into his jump seat. He leaned close to Rena. He's not here to hurt anyone, Owen whispered. He's protecting them. Rena looked at Valen, then at the Hales. Who is he? I don't know, Owen said. And I don't think I want to. The turbulence finally eased. The cabin lights steadied. Passengers began to stir, murmuring nervously to one another. Milo woke up, rubbing his eyes. He looked at his mother, then at Valen, then slipped out of his seat before Serena could stop him. Milo. But the boy had already crawled across the narrow gap between seats and climbed into Valen's lap, curling against his chest like it was the most natural thing in the world. Valen went rigid. His hands hovered in the air, uncertain, as if he'd forgotten how to hold something so small and precious. Serena watched, her heart in her throat. You're cold, Milo mumbled sleepily. But it's okay. You're not scary. Slowly, so slowly, Valen's arms lowered. His hands settled gently around the child, one palm against Milo's back, the other cradling his head. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the Vampire King held a child again. His eyes closed, his breath shuddered, and across the aisle, Serena saw the truth written plainly on his ancient face. This monster was not her enemy. He was just as broken as she was. The cabin had fallen into the hushed quiet that comes after a crisis. Most passengers had drifted back to sleep, lulled by exhaustion and the steady hum of the engines. The overhead lights remained dimmed, casting everything in soft amber shadow. Milo slept curled against Valen's chest, his small hand clutching the vampire's collar, his breath warm and steady. Valen sat motionless, afraid that even the slightest movement might disturb the fragile trust the child had placed in him. Serena watched them for a long moment, her mind still struggling to reconcile what she'd witnessed. A monster, he'd called himself. But monsters didn't cradle children with such reverence. Monsters didn't tremble at the weight of innocence in their arms. "I was supposed to be a teacher," Serena said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Valen's eyes shifted to her, but he didn't speak. He simply listened. "I had a scholarship. Full ride to the state university." She smiled bitterly. "I was going to change the world, you know? Help kids who came from nothing like I did. Give them a chance." She looked down at her hands, at the calluses from too many shifts carrying trays and cleaning tables. "Then I met Derek at a campus party. He was charming, attentive, said all the right things." Her throat tightened. "By the time I realized what he really was, I was pregnant and alone. He didn't want a child, didn't want the responsibility, but he didn't want me to leave either." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Control. That's all he ever wanted. When I finally tried to go, he made sure I knew he'd always be watching, always waiting. Valen's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "I dropped out, took whatever jobs I could find, moved 4 times in 3 years. Serena's voice wavered. "I kept thinking, if I could just get far enough away, if I could just start over somewhere he'd never think to look." She wiped her eyes. "I'm so tired of running, but I'll run forever if it means Milo stays safe." "You are stronger than you know," Valen said quietly. Serena looked up, surprised. "I have witnessed empires rise and fall," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "I have seen warriors who commanded armies, rulers who bent nations to their will. Yet few possess the kind of strength it takes to do what you have done." His gaze held hers. "You fight for him every day, without weapons, without power, without rest. That is true courage." Serena felt tears slip down her cheeks. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Derek had called her weak. Her mother had called her foolish. Her former friends had simply stopped calling. "Thank you," she whispered. Valen nodded once, then looked down at the sleeping child in his arms. "He grounds me," he admitted, "in a way I cannot explain. For the first time in centuries, I feel present, here, not lost in the past." "He has that effect on people," Serena said softly. "He sees the good in everyone, even when it's buried." Milo stirred, blinking sleepily. He sat up in Valen's lap, yawning, then noticed the napkin and pen on the tray table beside them, left over from the flight attendant's earlier drink service. "Can I draw?" he asked Serena. "Of course, baby." Milo carefully unfolded the napkin and picked up the pen, his tongue poking out in concentration as he began to sketch. His lines were wobbly and uncertain, the way a child's always are, but he drew with purpose. Serena watched, a small smile tugging at her lips. Valen remained still, though his eyes followed every movement of the boy's small hand. After a few minutes, Milo held up the napkin proudly. 3 stick figures stood side by side. One had long hair, clearly Serena. One was tiny, holding what might have been a penguin, Milo himself. And between them stood a third figure, taller, with long hair that Milo had colored heavily with a pen to make it look silver. "That's us," Milo announced. He pointed to Valen's figure. "I put you next to us, so you won't be lonely." The napkin trembled in Valen's hands. He stared at this simple, childish drawing that somehow held more power than any spell, any throne, any crown he'd ever possessed. 3 figures. A family. A family. His throat constricted. His vision blurred at the edges. For the first time in 1,000 years, he felt the hot pressure of tears gathering behind his eyes. But they didn't fall. He wouldn't let them. Not yet. "May I keep this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Milo nodded enthusiastically. "It's yours. So you can remember you have friends now." Valen carefully folded the napkin and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, over his heart. His hands shook as he did so. "Thank you," he whispered. "I will treasure it." Serena watched him, and in that moment, she saw past the inhuman features, past the crimson eyes and pale skin. She saw the way he looked at Milo, not with hunger, not with calculation, but with something achingly tender. The way a father might look at his child. The way someone looks at the one thing in all the world that matters. Not as prey, as something sacred. "You really lost a son," she said softly. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Valen's voice cracked. His name was Theron. He was 7 when he died. Mortal, like his mother. I thought immortality made me powerful enough to protect him from anything. He closed his eyes. I was wrong. Milo climbed back into his own seat, but kept his hand resting on Valen's arm, a small bridge between them. "I'm sorry," Serena said. "No parent should have to bury their child." "No," Valen agreed. "They should not." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of shared grief, of understanding that needed no words. The plane flew on through the darkness, miles above the earth, carrying its strange cargo of broken souls and fragile hope. After a while, Valen spoke again, so quietly that Serena almost didn't hear him. "Perhaps your son is a miracle." Serena looked at Milo, who was humming softly to himself, content and unaware of the weight of the moment. "He's the only miracle I've ever known," she said. Valen's gaze remained fixed on the child. "Then I am blessed to have met him." And for the first time since boarding this flight, Serena realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't running alone anymore. Maybe fate had placed someone in her path who understood what it meant to lose everything. And maybe, against all reason, this ancient creature of night would become the protector her son needed. Outside the window, stars began to break through the thinning clouds, scattered diamonds against the black. The storm was passing, but the real tempest, the one that would test them all, was still to come. The stars outside had multiplied, a vast field of cold light against the infinite black. The plane had climbed above the weather, but Serena could still feel the storm, not outside, but in the charged air between her and the creature sitting across the aisle. Valen hadn't moved in nearly 10 minutes. He sat with his hands resting on the armrests, the napkin drawing tucked safely against his heart, his expression unreadable. But Serena had learned to see past the mask. She recognized the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly as if holding himself back from speaking. Finally, he broke the silence. "I can protect you," he said quietly. "Both of you." Serena's breath caught. "What?" Valen turned to face her fully. "The man you're running from, Derek. He will not stop searching. Men like him never do." His crimson eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "But I can ensure he never finds you, never harms you. I can make you both untouchable." "How?" Serena whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. "I have resources your world cannot fathom. Connections that span centuries. Power that—" He stopped, choosing his words carefully. "I could erase you from every system he might use to track you. I could ensure that if he ever came close, he would face consequences that would destroy him utterly." It was everything Serena had dreamed of. Safety. Freedom. The ability to stop looking over her shoulder. But the price? In exchange for what? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Valen hesitated, and in that pause, she saw his vulnerability. "Nothing you would not freely give. I ask only." He looked at Milo, sleeping peacefully in his seat. "Let me remain in his life. As a guardian. A protector." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Your son has awakened something I believed dead. Something I thought lost with Theron 1,000 years ago. He has reminded me what it means to care for someone beyond myself." Serena felt her throat tighten. "You want to be part of his life. I want to ensure he grows up safe. Happy. Free." Valen's hands trembled slightly. "I have nothing else, Serena." No kingdom I wish to return to. No purpose that calls to me. But when that child touched my sleeve and offered me friendship, he closed his eyes. For the first time in centuries, I felt hope. Serena's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to accept. This was the answer to every prayer she'd whispered in the dark, every desperate wish she'd made while counting pennies for bus fare and cheap motels. But he wasn't human. He was ancient, powerful, dangerous, no matter how gentle he seemed with Milo. What would it mean to bind her son to a creature of darkness? What would Milo become, growing up under the protection of a vampire king? I can't, she whispered. The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Valen went completely still. I see. You don't understand, Serena's voice cracked. I can't tie my son to someone who isn't. She couldn't finish the sentence. The words felt cruel, but the fear was overwhelming. Human, Valen finished for her. His voice was hollow. You cannot tie him to a monster. That's not what I meant. That is precisely what you meant. Valen turned away, his profile sharp and cold in the dim light. You are right to refuse. I am a fool to have asked. Valen. I would not harm him. His voice rose slightly, raw with emotion he could no longer contain. I would die for him. I would burn every bridge to my past, abandon every connection to my realm, become nothing but shadow and silence if it meant keeping him safe. But you cannot trust that. You cannot trust me. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw genuine pain in those crimson eyes. And you are right not to. The cabin lights flickered.
Once. Twice.
Then a prolonged dimming that made several passengers stir nervously. Serena felt the temperature drop. Frost began forming on the edges of the windows, delicate crystalline patterns that spread like fingers reaching across the glass. Valen, she said carefully, you need to. I apologize. His voice was tight, controlled, but barely. I am not myself. The lights stabilized, but the frost remained. Valen's grief had become a physical presence in the cabin, a cold weight that pressed against everyone's skin. Rena, strapped into her jump seat in the galley, exchanged a worried glance with Owen. They both felt it, the wrongness, the sense that reality itself was bending around the pale man in 3A. Milo woke up. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, then looked at Valen. Whatever he saw in the vampire's face made his own expression crumple with concern. Without a word, Milo unbuckled his seatbelt. Milo, stay here. Serena reached for him, but he was already moving. He crossed the narrow aisle and climbed into Valen's lap, wrapping his small arms around the vampire's neck. Don't be sad, he whispered. I'm here. Valen froze, his breath catching. You're still my friend, Milo continued, his voice muffled against Valen's shoulder. Even if Mom is scared, I'm not scared. Slowly, so slowly, Valen's arms came up to hold the child. His hands were shaking. You should be, he whispered. I am dangerous. Nah. Milo pulled back just enough to look at him. You saved me when I fell. You held my penguin. You kept my drawing. He touched Valen's cheek with one small hand. You're not dangerous. You're just lonely. A single tear escaped down Valen's face before he could stop it. He caught it quickly, as if ashamed, but Milo had already seen. It's okay to be sad, Milo said seriously. Mom cries sometimes too. That's when I give her hugs. He settled against Valen's chest and closed his eyes, his hand finding Valen's and holding it tight. Valen sat motionless, staring down at the child in his arms. The frost on the windows began to recede. The temperature slowly returned to normal. The oppressive weight in the cabin lifted. And across the aisle, Serena watched her son, her brave, impossibly empathetic son, offer comfort to an ancient creature who had lived 1,000 years in darkness. Milo's breathing deepened into sleep. His small fingers remained wrapped around Valen's. Valen didn't move, didn't speak. He simply held the child like he was the most precious thing in all the worlds. Serena felt something shift inside her chest. a crack in the wall of fear she'd built. Her son trusted him completely, without hesitation, without doubt. And Milo had never been wrong about people. Not once. Maybe. Serena's voice was barely audible. Maybe we should talk about this. When we land. Valen's eyes met hers, and in them she saw hope flickering back to life. Fragile, tentative, but real. When we land, he agreed softly. Outside the window, the stars watched in silence, bearing witness to the moment when a mother's certainty began to fracture and a monster began to believe in second chances. The first sign was the cold. Not the gentle chill that had accompanied Valen's grief, but something else entirely, a bone-deep, unnatural cold that seemed to leach the warmth from every living thing. Breath turned to fog. Metal surfaces grew slick with ice. Serena shivered violently, pulling her thin jacket tighter. Around the cabin, passengers stirred from sleep, confused and uncomfortable. One woman in the back called for a flight attendant, her voice edged with worry. Then the smell came. Rot and ash and something older, something that had no name in any human language. It filled the cabin like invisible smoke, making eyes water and throats close. Valen's head snapped up. His expression transformed from gentle contemplation to absolute horror. "No," he breathed. "Not here. Not now." He carefully lifted Milo and placed him back in Serena's arms. "Hold him. Do not let go." "What's happening?" The temperature plummeted another 20 degrees. And then reality tore. It started as a hairline fracture in the air near the rear galley, a seam where darkness bled through like ink in water. The fracture widened, splitting with a sound like breaking bones, and through it came something that should not exist. The shadow monarch emerged into the cabin. It had no fixed form, just writhing darkness and too many eyes, burning with cold silver fire. Its presence bent the space around it, making the cabin walls ripple like water. Where it moved, metal corroded and plastic cracked. The overhead panels began to splinter. A passenger screamed. Then everyone was screaming. People scrambled from their seats, pressing against the forward bulkhead, climbing over each other in blind panic. The creature's attention swept across them like a searchlight, and wherever that gaze fell, frost bloomed on skin, and clothes froze solid. Valen Draker. The thing spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The exiled king. The broken crown. You cannot hide from your realm forever. Valen stepped into the aisle, placing himself between the entity and every human soul on the plane. "I left," he said, his voice carrying a command that made the cabin walls vibrate. "I relinquished my throne. I have no quarrel with the court. The court has a quarrel with you." The shadow monarch expanded, filling half the cabin with its darkness. "You abandoned your kingdom in chaos. You refused your destiny. You must return, or be destroyed." "Then destroy me," Valen said quietly. "But you will not touch them." The entity lunged. Valen's power erupted. His silver hair lifted as if caught in an invisible wind, each strand glowing with pale light. His eyes blazed crimson, not with hunger, but with the ancient fury of a king who had commanded armies in the dark. The embroidered symbols on his suit, patterns Serena had thought merely decorative, ignited with silver-white fire, an arcane script that had been woven into the fabric centuries ago. He raised both hands, and the air between him and the shadow monarch crystallized into a barrier of pure force. The creature slammed against it, shrieking. The impact sent shockwaves through the cabin, shattering overhead lights and sending luggage tumbling from compartments. Oxygen masks dropped, swinging uselessly. Passengers huddled together, sobbing, prayers tumbling from their lips in a dozen languages. Valen held the barrier, but Serena could see it was costing him. His hands shook. Blood, dark and thick, began to seep from his nose. The shadow monarch pressed harder. "You protect mortals? You, who once ruled legions of the night." "I protect what matters," Valen growled. The barrier cracked. Serena clutched Milo to her chest, her body curled around him protectively. But she couldn't look away. She watched Valen stand against this nightmare-made flesh, watched him pour everything he had into keeping it at bay. And she understood. This was who he had been, a king of terrible power, a ruler of darkness. But this was also who he had become, someone who would sacrifice himself for people he barely knew. For a child who had shown him kindness. For a chance at redemption. Not a tyrant. A father who had lost his child and would die before watching it happen again. The Shadow Monarch shifted tactics. Instead of pressing forward, it expanded outward, tendrils of darkness reaching around Valen's barrier toward the passengers. No! Valen roared. He dropped the barrier and did something Serena didn't think possible. He moved faster than sight, positioning himself between every tendril and every human. His body became a shield, taking the impact of each strike. Dark energy ripped through him. His coat tore. His skin split. But he didn't fall. Instead, he began to push back. Silver light poured from his hands, from his eyes, from the very core of his being. Ancient words spilled from his lips, a language of power that predated civilizations. The symbols on his suit burned so bright they left afterimages. The Shadow Monarch screamed, a sound that made windows crack and metal groan. "I am Valen Draker," the Vampire King declared, his voice shaking the foundations of reality itself. "I am the Silver Throne. I am the father of the fallen prince. And you will not harm these people." He thrust both hands forward. Pure white light exploded from his palms, engulfing the Shadow Monarch entirely. The creature thrashed, writhing, its form dissolving under the onslaught. The rift it had torn began to collapse, reality stitching itself back together, like a wound closing. With a final, fading shriek, the Shadow Monarch was driven back into its realm. The rift is sealed. Silence crashed over the cabin like a wave. For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. Then Valen collapsed. He fell to his knees in the aisle, his hands braced against the floor, blood dripping from dozens of wounds. His silver hair hung limp around his face. His breathing came in ragged gasps. But he had won. Serena carefully set Milo down. The boy was wide-eyed but unharmed, and moved toward Valen. Her hands hovered over his shoulders, unsure if she should touch him. "You saved us," she whispered. Valen lifted his head slowly. His eyes had returned to their normal crimson, but they were filled with exhaustion. "I told you," he said hoarsely. "I would die for him." Milo slipped past Serena and knelt in front of Valen. He touched the vampire's face gently, his small fingers coming away, wet with blood. "You're hurt," Milo said, his voice trembling. "I will heal," Valen assured him. Around them, passengers began to stir. The crew emerged from where they'd taken shelter, their faces pale with shock. Owen moved through the cabin, checking on people, his hands shaking but his voice steady. Rena approached Valen slowly. "What do we tell them?" she asked quietly. Valen looked up at her, too exhausted to lie. "Tell them it was severe turbulence. Tell them they imagined the rest. Tell them whatever allows them to sleep tonight." Rena nodded and moved away to begin damage control. Valen's gaze returned to Milo, and his expression softened. "I am sorry you had to see that. You protected everyone," Milo said simply. "Like a superhero." Despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the knowledge that his exile would now be hunted, Valen smiled. "Not a superhero," he said. "Just someone who finally found something worth fighting for." And as Serena helped him back to his seat, as Milo refused to leave his side, she realized that her fear had burned away in the light of that silver fire. This creature had stood between her son and annihilation, and she would never doubt him again. Valen sat slumped in his seat, his body a tapestry of wounds that were already beginning to close with unnatural speed. But healing took energy, and he had none left. His hands trembled in his lap. His silver hair was matted with dark blood. The embroidered symbols on his suit had burned themselves out, leaving only ash-gray marks on the fabric. Around them, the cabin was a disaster. Shattered plastic littered the aisles. Overhead panels hung at odd angles. Scorch marks traced patterns across the walls where the Shadow Monarch's darkness had touched. The acrid smell of burnt metal lingered despite the circulation systems working overtime. Passengers huddled in small groups, their faces pale, voices hushed. Some were crying. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd witnessed, or convince themselves they hadn't witnessed it at all. Serena knelt beside Valen's seat, her hand hovering near his arm, still afraid to touch him without permission. Milo stood pressed against her side, his penguin clutched tight, watching Valen with worried eyes. "Does it hurt?" Milo asked softly. Valen managed a weak smile. "Less than you might think. I have endured worse." "That doesn't make it okay," Milo said with the absolute certainty of a child who hasn't yet learned that pain can be dismissed. He pulled away from Serena before she could stop him and wrapped his small arms around Valen's leg, pressing his cheek against the vampire's knee. "Don't be scared," Milo whispered. "You're not lonely now." Valen went absolutely still. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Serena felt it, a shift in the air, a building pressure that made her ears pop. Valen's eyes widened, his breath catching. "Milo," he started to say, but the words died in his throat. Power erupted from him, not the violent, destructive force he'd wielded against the Shadow Monarch, but something else entirely. Something pure. Silver light blazed from his chest, from his hands, from every inch of his being. But it wasn't hot. It was warm, gentle, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds after years of darkness. The light spread through the cabin, and where it touched, things began to heal. Cracked panels smoothed themselves. Shattered lights reformed, their filaments rewinding into wholeness. Scorch marks faded from the walls like ghosts at dawn. Even the passengers' cuts and bruises began to fade, their pain easing as the light washed over them. Serena watched in awe as the destruction reversed itself, as if time itself were bending to Valen's will. But Valen wasn't controlling it. He looked just as shocked as everyone else. The light concentrated near the rear galley, where the rift had torn reality open. The faint traces of darkness that still lingered there, shadows that writhed weakly against the corners, met the silver radiance and simply dissolved. No fight, no resistance. Just a quiet erasure, like fog burning away in the morning sun. The last remnants of the Shadow Monarch's presence vanished completely. The light faded slowly, retreating back into Valen until the cabin looked almost normal, damaged by severe turbulence, perhaps, but nothing that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena. Valen sagged back in his seat, his face ashen. "How did I?" "Love," came a voice from behind them. They turned to see Rena standing in the aisle, her expression a mixture of fear and wonder. "My grandmother told me stories. Old stories. She said the ancient ones, the vampires, the fae, the things that walked before human memory, drew power from different sources. Some from blood, some from darkness." She looked at Milo, still holding onto Valen's leg. "And some from love, from being chosen, accepted." "I don't understand," Valen whispered. "He gave you permission to care," Rena said simply. "And that broke something open in you." Before Valen could respond, Damien, the third flight attendant, who'd been helping passengers in the rear, approached with his hands full of broken plastic pieces. "We're calling this severe turbulence," he said firmly. "Unprecedented wind shear. Possibly a microburst." Whatever it was, he looked directly at Valen. It wasn't supernatural. Officially. Owen joined them, his arms full of oxygen masks that had deployed. "I'll file the report. No one will question it. We've all seen the news, freak weather patterns, unexplained phenomena. This fits the narrative." "Why are you doing this?" Valen asked, his voice hoarse. Owen met his gaze steadily. "Because you didn't have to protect us. You could have let that thing take whoever it wanted if it meant avoiding a fight. But you didn't." He glanced at the passengers, most of whom were now being tended to by the crew. "You put yourself between it and everyone on this plane. That's all I need to know about you. Rena nodded. We'll handle the cleanup. You just rest. The crew moved away, gathering debris, speaking in calm tones to passengers, weaving a story of natural disaster that would let everyone sleep at night. Serena watched them go, then turned back to Valen. He looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with his wounds. He looked like someone who'd just been shown kindness he didn't think he deserved. She reached out and touched his shoulder, no hesitation this time. You protected us, she said softly. All of us. When you could have run, when you could have hidden, when you could have saved only yourself, you chose to stand between us and that thing. Her voice strengthened. I won't run from you anymore. Valen's eyes met hers, and she saw everything in them. Centuries of loneliness, the grief of losing his son, the desperate hope that maybe, impossibly, he'd been given a second chance. I don't deserve. Don't, Serena interrupted gently. Don't tell me what you deserve. Let me decide that. Milo finally released Valen's leg and climbed back into his own seat, but he kept one hand resting on Valen's arm, a connection, a promise. Are you still scared of him, Mom? Milo asked. Serena looked at Valen, at the ancient creature who had just rewritten reality itself to heal the damage from a battle he'd fought to protect strangers. At the vampire king who trembled when a child offered him affection. At the father who had lost everything and was terrified to hope for anything again. No, she said. I'm not scared anymore. Valen's breath shuddered. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was something different in them. Something like peace. When we land, he said quietly, I will do whatever you ask of me. If you want me to disappear, I will. If you want me to stay distant, I will. But know this. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I would die for your child. I would die for you. Not because I owe you. Not because of some ancient code. But because for the first time in 1,000 years, I have something worth living for. Serena felt tears slip down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. Then live, she said.
Stay.
Be part of his life. Be part of ours. Valen stared at her, speechless. Milo yawned, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving only exhaustion. Does this mean Valen can come to Grandma's house? He asked sleepily. Serena laughed, a genuine, surprised sound that felt like the first real laugh she'd had in years. Maybe not yet, baby, but someday, I promise. Milo smiled and nestled into a seat. Within moments, his breathing evened into sleep. Valen watched him, his expression unguarded, raw with emotion. Thank you, he whispered to Serena. Don't thank me yet, she said with a small smile. You're about to find out how exhausting a 3-year-old can be. And despite everything, despite the battle, the wounds, the destruction, the impossibility of it all, Valen laughed. It was quiet and rusty, as if he'd forgotten how. But it was real. And outside the window, the first hints of dawn began to paint the horizon in shades of gold and rose. The night was ending, and with it, the loneliness that had haunted them all. The emergency lights had kicked in after the battle, casting the cabin in a soft, amber glow that was gentler than the harsh fluorescence. Most passengers had finally drifted into exhausted sleep, their minds already beginning the work of rewriting what they'd seen into something more palatable. Turbulence. A nightmare shared. Anything but the truth. The crew moved quietly through the aisles, distributing blankets and water, their faces carefully neutral. They didn't speak of what they'd witnessed. Some things were better left unspoken. Serena had moved to the seat beside Valen. She told herself it was to keep an eye on his wounds, to make sure he was healing properly. But the truth was simpler than that. She didn't want him to be alone. Valen's breathing had grown shallow over the past half hour. The silver light that had erupted from him had drained reserves he didn't have. His skin, already pale, had taken on an almost translucent quality. The dark blood had stopped flowing from his wounds, but they hadn't fully closed either, suspended in a state between injury and healing. You need to feed, Serena said quietly. It wasn't a question. Valen's eyes opened slowly. I will endure. That's not what I asked. I will not. He stopped, choosing his words carefully. I do not feed from the innocent. Not anymore. Not for centuries. Then what do you? There are other ways, he said softly. Less immediate, less sustaining, but sufficient. He managed a weak smile. I have become quite skilled at enduring. Serena looked at him, truly looked at him, at the way he held himself apart even now, afraid his very nature might somehow contaminate them. By the way he poured everything he had into protecting strangers, leaving nothing for himself. You're an idiot, she said, but there was no heat in it. Only a strange, aching fondness. Valen's smile widened fractionally. I have been called worse. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Milo sleep across the aisle, his penguin clutched to his chest, his face peaceful. Then Valen spoke, his voice, so quiet Serena had to lean closer to hear. If I leave you now, when we land, I return to a kingdom of silence. His eyes remained fixed on Milo. For 1,000 years, I have walked alone. I have commanded armies, ruled territories, built empires in the dark. I have had subjects and servants, and those who feared me enough to call themselves loyal.
He paused.
But I have not had a family. Not since Theron died in my arms. Serena's throat tightened. Your son touched my sleeve and called me lonely, and I realized. Valen's voice cracked. I realized that every century of power, every conquest, every throne I've ever sat upon has been nothing but noise to drown out the silence of that loss. He turned to face her, and his eyes held such raw vulnerability that Serena forgot to breathe. Let me stay near your son, Valen said. Not as a king, not as some ancient creature trading protection for access, but as... He struggled with the word, as if it were foreign to him. As a family. Let me be someone who watches him grow, who teaches him, who keeps him safe not out of obligation, but because his laughter is the first thing in a millennium that has made me want to see tomorrow. Serena felt tears gathering. Valen, I know I have no right to ask, he continued, words tumbling out now as if he couldn't stop them. I know what I am. I know the darkness I carry. But that child, your child, he saw past all of it. He offered me friendship when I deserved nothing. He gave me hope when I had forgotten what it tasted like. His hands clenched in his lap. If I walk away now, I will survive. I always survive. But I don't think I will ever truly live again. The cabin hummed around them. Dawn continued its slow arrival beyond the windows, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. Serena reached out and took Valen's hand. His skin was cold, but his fingers curled around hers with desperate gentleness. I need to know something, she said. And I need you to answer me honestly, with everything you are. Anything. She met his gaze and held it. You would never hurt him? No matter what? No matter if you're starving, no matter if your nature demands it, no matter if every instinct screams at you too. Never. The word came out with such force, such absolute certainty, that it seemed to echo in the space between them. I would tear out my own heart first. I would walk into the sun. I would return to the kingdom that betrayed me and let them destroy me. But I would never, never harm that child. And me? Serena asked. Would you hurt me? I would rather cease to exist. Serena studied his face, searching for any hint of deception, any shadow of doubt. But she found only the truth, a painful, desperate truth. She thought of Derek, who had promised to love her and then spent 3 years teaching her what control disguised as affection looked like. She thought of the fear that had become her constant companion, the hypervigilance that made every footstep behind her a threat. And then she thought of Valen, standing between her son and an entity of pure darkness. Valen, healing the cabin with power fueled by a child's affection. Valen, who trembled when Milo offered him a sticker. She had spent 3 years learning to recognize monsters. And this creature, despite everything he was, wasn't one of them. Then stay, she said. The words hung in the air like a benediction. Valen's breath caught. You're certain? I'm terrified, Serena admitted. I'm exhausted, I'm confused, and I have no idea how to explain any of this to my mother.
But yes.
I'm certain. She squeezed his hand. Stay. Be part of his life. Be part of ours. Valen closed his eyes, and a single tear traced down his pale cheek. I will not fail you. Either of you. This I swear on everything I am, everything I was, and everything I might yet become. Then, moving with visible effort, he shifted from his seat and knelt in the narrow aisle before her. It was an ancient gesture, one that predated modern etiquette, predated nations and laws. It was the posture of a knight before a liege, a subject before a queen. But more than that, it was the gesture of someone offering everything they had to someone they deemed worthy of it. Valen took Serena's hand in both of his and pressed his forehead to her knuckles. Valen Draker, once king of Eldrathis, lord of the Silver Throne, guardian of the Eternal Night, I pledge myself to you and yours. Your enemies are my enemies. Your joy is my purpose. Your child's safety is my sacred charge. His voice dropped to a whisper. I am yours if you will have me. Serena felt the weight of the vow, felt it settle over them like something tangible, something real. This wasn't just words. This was magic, ancient and binding. I accept, she said softly. Rise, Valen. You're not my subject. You're my friend. Valen lifted his head, and the expression on his face was something Serena suspected no one had seen in centuries. Pure, unguarded gratitude. He returned to his seat, and they sat together in the amber glow, watching Milo sleep, while outside the window the sun finally broke over the horizon. A new day was beginning, and with it, a family, strange and impossible and forged in the crucible of a midnight flight, was born. Thank you, Valen whispered. Serena smiled. Thank me when you've survived your first grocery store trip with a 3-year-old. Despite everything, Valen laughed, and it sounded like freedom. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, steady and professional despite everything the crew had witnessed. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. We'll be landing in approximately 15 minutes. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us, and we appreciate your patience during tonight's unexpected turbulence. The word turbulence hung in the air like a shared secret. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings with the careful movements of people who'd been through something they couldn't quite name. No one spoke of what they'd seen. Perhaps they'd already convinced themselves it was a dream, a mass hallucination brought on by fear and oxygen deprivation. Or perhaps they simply understood that some truths were too large to speak aloud. Serena gently woke Milo, who blinked sleepily and immediately looked for Valen. The vampire had returned to his own seat but remained close, his posture protective even in his weakened state. Are we there? Milo asked, rubbing his eyes. Almost, baby, Serena said softly. Almost home. The plane descended through layers of cloud, and suddenly the world appeared below them, city lights fading into the golden wash of sunrise, streets and buildings emerging from the darkness, like a promise. Valen watched through the window, his expression unreadable. It's been decades since I've watched a sunrise without fearing it, he murmured. Does it hurt you? Serena asked. The sun. Only if I let it. He turned to her with a faint smile. I am old enough to have learned how to walk in daylight, though it weakens me. I simply chose not to for a very long time. There seemed no reason to. And now, he said, looking at Milo, I have a reason. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump. The plane rolled along the runway, slowing gradually and finally came to a stop at the gate. Through the windows, emergency vehicles were already visible, fire trucks and ambulances lined up, their lights flashing in the early morning. Protocol? Owen explained, appearing beside them. After an incident like this, the turbulence, they always send emergency crews. Just in case. Rena leaned in, her voice low. We've already filed the report. Severe clear air turbulence. Possible microburst. Some minor injuries. All treated on board. Nothing that requires investigation. She met Valen's gaze. Your secret is safe. Why? Valen asked again. Why protect me? Damien, who'd been helping passengers gather their things, paused. Because you protected us first. That's how it works, isn't it? We take care of each other. He offered a tired smile. Besides, who'd believe us anyway? The cabin door opened, and paramedics rushed aboard, their faces set with professional concern. They began assessing passengers, checking for injuries, and asking gentle questions. The crew directed them with practiced efficiency, their story consistent and believable. No one mentioned the rift. No one mentioned the Shadow Monarch. No one mentioned the silver light that had healed them all. Serena gathered their few belongings, Milo's backpack, her worn duffel bag, and Waddles the penguin. Valen rose slowly, steadying himself against the seat. His wounds had closed enough that they weren't visible, but she could tell each movement cost him. Can you walk? She asked quietly. I will manage. That's not what I asked. Valen looked at her, and something warm flickered in his eyes. I appreciate your concern. But yes, I can walk. Though I may need to find a place to rest once we're away from here. We'll figure it out, Serena said, and realized, with a start, that she meant we. They joined the slow line of passengers disembarking. Valen moved with careful dignity, no longer trying to hide what he was, not displaying it, but not shrinking from it either. His silver hair caught the morning light streaming through the terminal windows. His crimson eyes were steady. Several passengers glanced at him as they passed, recognition flickering in their expressions, not of his name or nature, but of the man who had stood between them and darkness. A few nodded. One elderly woman touched his arm gently and whispered, Thank you. Valen looked startled, then simply bowed his head in acknowledgement. They emerged into the terminal, and the sunrise hit them full force, golden light streaming through massive windows, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. Valen paused, his face tilted toward the sun, his eyes closed. For a moment, he simply stood there, bathing in light he'd avoided for centuries. It's warm, he said softly, wonderingly. I'd forgotten. Milo tugged on Valen's hand. Don't you like the sun? I'm learning to, Valen replied. Serena adjusted her bag and looked around the terminal, at the scattered travelers, the coffee shops opening for the morning rush, the departure boards clicking through destinations. Somewhere out there was the life she'd been running toward. But now, standing here with her son and an ancient vampire who'd sworn to protect them, everything felt different. Where do we go from here? She asked. Valen looked down at Milo, who was already scanning the terminal with wide-eyed curiosity, then back to Serena. Wherever the boy leads, he said simply. Milo, overhearing, brightened. Grandma's house. She has a big tree and cookies, and he stopped, looking between Serena and Valen with sudden seriousness. Can Valen come? Please. Serena laughed, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't managed in years. Maybe not today, baby. Grandma might need some time to prepare for house guests. But soon, Milo pressed. But soon, Serena agreed, meeting Valen's gaze. We'll figure it out. Milo seemed satisfied with that answer. He reached up and took both their hands, Serena's on one side, Valen's on the other, and began walking toward the exit, pulling them along. See, he said cheerfully, we're not lonely anymore. Those simple words hit Serena like a physical blow. She looked at her son, at his absolute certainty that the world was a place where lonely people could find each other and broken things could be mended. And she looked at Valen, who walked beside them with something like wonder on his ancient face. No, Valen whispered, his voice thick with emotion. No, we're not. They stepped through the automatic doors and into the morning. The sun rose higher, burning away the last traces of night. Somewhere behind them, a plane prepared for another journey. Somewhere ahead, a life waited, uncertain, complicated, but no longer solitary. Valen Draker, once king of Eldrathis, lord of the Silver Throne, ruler of nightmares and commander of shadows, walked into the daylight holding the hand of a 3-year-old boy who'd offered him friendship in the darkness. He had lost kingdoms. He had abandoned thrones. He had walked alone for 1,000 years. But here, in this moment, in this ordinary airport terminal with its ordinary people rushing toward ordinary lives, he felt something he'd thought lost forever. He felt like he belonged. A young mother with eyes full of hard-won strength walked on his right. A child who saw hearts instead of monsters walked on his left. And ahead of them stretched not just a runway, but a future, messy and unknown, and more precious than any crown. Valen. Milo looked up at him. "What do vampires eat for breakfast?" Serena groaned. "Milo, we talked about this." But Valen laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh that turned heads across the terminal. "I suppose I'll have to find out. It's been rather a long time since I had breakfast." "You can share my cereal," Milo offered generously. "It has marshmallows." "Then I would be honored." They walked on, 3 figures silhouetted against the sunrise, their shadows stretching long behind them. Behind them lay a night of turbulence and terror, of ancient powers and impossible choices. But ahead lay something simpler, something harder, something infinitely more valuable. A chance to build a family from the wreckage of broken lives. And as Valen felt the sun on his face and the small hand in his, as he listened to Milo chatter about marshmallow cereal and Serena's quiet laughter, he understood something he'd never fully grasped in a millennium of existence. This was what it meant to live. Not to rule. Not to conquer. Not to endure. But to belong. Their story, this strange, impossible, beautiful story, was only beginning. And for the first time in 1,000 years, Valen couldn't wait to see what came next.